You think you've seen uncomfortable moments at the airport? What if I told you that a simple, humiliating mistake at the boarding gate turned into a national headline 30 minutes later? Why did a flight attendant feel so sure that the black woman she just humiliated worked as airport cleaning staff? And how did that same woman end up in control of the very aircraft they were about to board? Who was she really? And what happened after that door to the cockpit closed? The answers, when they come, won't just surprise you. They'll force you to look at things differently. Subscribe if you haven't yet, because this is a story you're going to want to follow to the end. At Gate 39 of Terminal C, the airport buzzed with the usual chaos. Announcements drowning in static, rolling suitcases stuttering across uneven tiles, voices rising in frustration over missed connections and overpriced coffee. Among the blur of movement stood Naomi Harris, dressed in simple dark slacks and a soft grey blouse, a rolling carry-on in one hand and a thin leather binder tucked under her arm. She waited silently near the crew entrance, watching the time blink by on the overhead screen. No badge visible, no uniform, just stillness and quiet control. Claire Weston, the senior flight attendant assigned to Flight 227, had just arrived from a layover and was already in a rush. Her blazer was impeccable, her hair pinned with military precision, and her tone sharp even in moments of courtesy. She spotted Naomi standing near the door marked "Authorized Personnel Only," looking in her eyes suspiciously out of place. Without even slowing her step, she gestured vaguely toward a trash bin, overflowing with crumpled wrappers, and said, "Excuse me, hun, someone left a mess here. Can you make sure it's taken care of before we start boarding?" Naomi looked at her, not startled, not offended, but with the kind of measured silence that says far more than any outburst could. Claire moved past, unaware of the eyes now watching her from across the gate. Lucia Reyes, an intern from Public Affairs shadowing the crew today for a diversity initiative, had caught every word. She didn't say anything yet, but she took a photo, quietly, just in case. Naomi didn't correct Claire. She didn't have to. She waited 5 more minutes, then moved through the secured door with a single swipe of her ID. Inside the narrow crew corridor, her posture shifted ever so slightly. Not arrogant, not performative, but purposeful. She was heading to the cockpit, not to clean it, not to take notes, not to sit behind someone. She was in command today. 36 years old and only recently promoted to captain, Naomi had flown under the radar most of her life, sometimes out of caution, sometimes by design. Her records were flawless, her simulations impeccable, her hours above industry standard. But what they never showed on paper was the weight she carried into every room, the doubt she saw in glances, the misplaced assumptions, the micro-adjustments she made in tone and expression just to pass through spaces that were never designed for her. That morning was no different. The pre-flight checklist came naturally. Her co-pilot, a younger man named Eric with too much confidence and not enough experience, greeted her with the wide-eyed surprise of someone who expected someone else. He tried to recover fast, but Naomi had already moved on. She didn't need his adjustment. She needed his competence. Outside, boarding had begun. Claire returned to the front of the cabin, smiling at passengers, guiding families with children toward their rows, repeating greetings that had become second nature. She didn't notice Lucia watching her now, not with judgment, but curiosity, the kind that signals a question forming beneath the surface. Who are you when no one's watching? 10 minutes before takeoff, Claire entered the cockpit to deliver the manifest. The moment she saw Naomi in the left seat, adjusting instruments and reading system readouts aloud, her face froze. It was brief, half a second maybe, but unmistakable. Naomi didn't turn to look at her. She just continued, voice calm. "Weight distribution confirmed. We're clear on fuel. Cabin secure." Claire cleared her throat. "Yes, all set, Captain." There it was, the first time she'd said it. Captain, not Hon, not sweetie, not an unspoken presumption, just fact. And yet, even as she said it, Claire couldn't help but feel a quiet humiliation rise in her chest. Not because of Naomi's role, but because of her own error, her own arrogance. And it stung more because no one had scolded her. Naomi hadn't exposed her. She had simply let the truth speak for itself. Still, the unease didn't fade. Through the flight, Claire kept stealing glances toward the cockpit. Something about the silence unsettled her. Passengers were calm, the crew efficient, but Claire's mind kept circling the moment at the gate. Why hadn't Naomi said anything? Why hadn't she confronted her? Lucia sat near the back, typing on her tablet, pretending to edit old notes. In truth, she was writing something else. A draft, a short piece titled Gate 39, capturing a moment she couldn't unsee. She hadn't decided whether to publish it. Not yet. Midway through the flight, turbulence hit unexpectedly. Not severe, but sudden. Enough to rattle trays and draw nervous gasps. Claire rushed to reassure passengers, her voice smooth, automatic. In the cockpit, Naomi's hands were steady, her voice in control, issuing directives with the ease of instinct. Eric followed her lead, grateful not to be the one making the calls. The storm passed quickly, but the mood on board had shifted. Later, with the plane cruising in calm skies again, Claire stepped back into the cockpit. She didn't have to, but something in her compelled it. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. Naomi looked up, no expression of surprise, no bitterness, just listening. At the gate, "I assumed I made an assumption." "Yes," Naomi said. "You did." "I'm sorry," Claire added, unsure of how else to say it. Naomi didn't answer right away. Her eyes returned to the instrument panel, then the horizon. "Do better next time. Not just with me." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't condemnation either. It was instruction. Claire left the cockpit in silence. What she didn't know, what no one on board knew, was that Lucia had sent her draft to an editor that morning, and that editor had already forwarded it to their national team. The story would go live by morning. The headline wouldn't name anyone. It wouldn't need to, but it would ask a question. What do you see when you look at a black woman in an airport? And by the end of this flight, the answer would be rewritten at 30,000 feet. But that wasn't the last twist. Not even close. Because when the plane landed, Naomi was greeted not by applause or quiet acknowledgement. She was met by an airline executive waiting just beyond the jet bridge, holding a sealed folder and an offer that would turn the next chapter of her life upside down. It was raining in Atlanta when Flight 227 touched down, a slow, methodical rain that blurred the terminal windows and dulled the usual frenzy of a mid-afternoon arrival. Naomi guided the aircraft along the taxiway with quiet precision, her focus uninterrupted by the chatter in her headset or the shift in mood inside the cabin. She had long since learned to measure a successful landing, not in applause or recognition, but in the absence of alarm. That day, the runway had welcomed her back like an old friend, solid, dependable, silent. As the engines wound down, her co-pilot Eric exhaled and stretched his fingers. "Smooth landing, Captain," he said, offering a glance that hovered between respect and renewed uncertainty. He'd followed her lead the entire flight, adapting to her pace, adjusting to the tone she set. But something still lingered in his eyes, a quiet negotiation of the authority he'd seen and the bias he hadn't yet learned to name. Naomi didn't comment. She simply unbuckled her harness and began shutting down systems one by one, like a conductor closing a symphony. Claire, meanwhile, was making her way down the aisle with a professionalism that had begun to fray around the edges. Passengers thanked her as they filed out, most unaware of the incident at the gate or its aftershocks. But there were glances, a few lingering eyes, mostly from women, mostly from younger faces, who seemed to watch her not for what she did, but for how she held herself. The story wasn't public yet, but something had shifted, the kind of shift that travels faster than words. Outside, the executive waited just beyond the gate, Marcus Livingston, Regional Operations Director. He stood with his coat folded over one arm and a sealed envelope tucked under the other, glancing every so often at the arrival screen above him. His presence was not part of protocol, it was deliberate. His gaze fixed sharply on the bridge as soon as the door opened and the first crew member stepped through. Naomi appeared moments later, her carry-on rolling behind her, face calm but alert. Marcus approached without hesitation. "Captain Harris," he began, extending his hand. "I need 5 minutes of your time." She took the handshake, but not the invitation. "Is this about the incident this morning?" He smiled without amusement. "Partly, but not only. Walk with me." They moved through a quiet corridor behind the main terminal, a part of the airport few passengers ever saw. Frosted glass doors, industrial carpeting, the hum of security systems barely audible beneath the distant roar of departing aircraft. Naomi kept pace but said little. Marcus seemed to measure each sentence before he spoke. "There's been significant attention," he said. "An internal report was filed by a crew intern, Lucia Reyes. Her account was detailed, unprompted, accompanied by a photo." Naomi nodded slowly. "Did she name Claire?" "No, but the description was clear. What's more, before it reached our office, it landed on a journalist's desk. We expect a story within 24 hours. She stopped. "So this meeting is damage control." Marcus looked at her carefully. "No, it's an opportunity, but it depends on how you want to play it." She held his gaze. "I don't play." He smiled just slightly. "That's what makes this delicate. The company is anticipating a public reaction. Most of our executive board hasn't even seen the full report yet, but the communications team is already preparing statements. Inclusion, accountability, all the right words in the right order. And you? I'd prefer action." He handed her the envelope. Inside was a proposal, an invitation to lead a new internal task force with media visibility, direct access to senior leadership, and a seat at the next Pilot Development Summit in DC on behalf of the company. It was more than a promotion. It was exposure, influence, and a spotlight. She didn't open it. "So I become the face of the fix. You become the one in the room, the one steering the next generation." Naomi let the words settle. The idea of visibility had always come with a price. Too often it meant being celebrated for surviving the very system that had pushed you to the margins. But this wasn't about applause. It was about control, and that at least was currency she understood. "I'll think about it," she said. Marcus nodded. "There's one more thing." He hesitated, and in that hesitation, she knew it wasn't logistical, it was personal. "Claire Weston has requested to speak with you. Off record, no formal setting. She's in the terminal, waiting in one of the quiet lounges." Naomi's expression didn't change, but she adjusted her grip on the handle of her carry-on, not as a gesture, simply as a signal to herself that she had a choice. Where? The lounge was dimly lit, with high-backed chairs and soundproofing meant to mute even the tension of conversations like this. Claire sat near the window, hands folded tightly in her lap, posture impeccable, but eyes tired. When Naomi entered, Claire stood, but Naomi remained near the door, making no motion to join her. Claire spoke first. "I wanted to speak before anything else happens." Naomi didn't reply. "I've spent the last few hours reviewing everything I've said and done, not just this morning, but across years, flights, interactions, and I realize how many of them weren't about professionalism, but reflex, assumptions, and how often I've mistaken politeness for respect." Naomi watched her, expression unreadable. "I'm not asking for a pardon," Claire continued, "but I needed to say it to you, not to PR, not to HR, to you." There was silence then, not for lack of words, but because the moment demanded listening. Naomi stepped forward, not much, just enough to bridge the distance between confrontation and conversation. "You saw me standing there," she said, "and decided I didn't belong." Claire nodded. "Yes, and I can't justify it." Naomi tilted her head slightly. "No, but you can choose not to repeat it. That's the part that matters." Claire looked down. When she raised her head again, something had softened in her face. Not humility exactly, but clarity. "I'll step down from this route," she said. "It's not a punishment. I just think it's time I started over, from a different place." Naomi took a breath, deep and full. "Do what you need to, but starting over isn't about leaving. It's about returning with better sight." She turned then, not waiting for thanks or closure. She didn't need either. That night, Naomi stood in her apartment, envelope still unopened on the kitchen table. Outside, the city lights blinked through the mist of the rain, casting faint shadows on the walls. Her mother's voice echoed faintly from memory. "Keep your eyes forward, even when they won't meet yours." She poured a glass of water, No music playing, no television humming in the background, just the quiet weight of what the day had revealed. She picked up the envelope, not to accept or decline, but to read, to understand fully what it meant to be handed power, even in a moment shaped by someone else's failure, and what it would cost to wield it with intention. The story, as far as the world would see, had already happened. A misunderstanding, a moment corrected, a headline softened by progress. But Naomi knew better. The story wasn't over. The real shift hadn't happened at the gate or in the cockpit. It was happening now, in private, in silence, in the stillness after the spotlight moved on. And what she did next would decide whether the arc bent toward truth or convenience. What she didn't know, as she read the first line of the proposal, was that Lucia, the intern, the observer, the quiet recorder of moments, had received a message of her own from a reporter requesting an interview, the kind that doesn't ask for a quote, but a reckoning. Lucia Reyes wasn't naive, but she had underestimated how quickly a truth, once spoken aloud, could begin to unravel the scaffolding of comfort around those who had chosen not to see it. The reporter's message had arrived without preamble, no emoticons, no attempts at casual rapport, just a subject line, request to speak, story on flight 227, and a single line of text. Your observation might become the moment that defines something bigger. Confidentiality guaranteed, but honesty required. She read it twice before closing her laptop. The words were simple, measured, but beneath their restraint lay the unmistakable pressure of consequence. She wasn't being invited to comment. She was being asked to commit. In the days since submitting the report, Lucia had returned to her routine, checking equipment, reviewing pre-boarding procedures, smiling at passengers who barely registered her presence. But the moment on the tarmac, the one she had captured almost instinctively with her phone, lingered. She hadn't meant to turn it into a story. She had simply wanted to preserve a moment that felt wrong, deeply wrong, and for once not pretend it hadn't happened. She hadn't told anyone yet, not even her roommate, not her supervisor, not her mother, but now the world outside the airline had found her. Across town, Naomi stared at a blank screen in a darkened conference room. The proposal had not been rejected, nor had it been accepted. It sat suspended in the corporate ether, part of an ongoing strategic conversation. In truth, it was a placeholder, a test, and she knew that whatever goodwill the company had shown was not unconditional. It was calibrated, responsive, timed to the fluctuations of public attention, and public attention, she sensed, was about to sharpen. She had spent the morning at a leadership training summit, surrounded by polished men in tailored blazers, most of whom referred to her by title, but rarely by name. They asked questions designed to sound inclusive. How do we build equity into legacy systems? How do we expand access while protecting standards? But none of them asked her what it had cost to stay. None of them wanted to know what had been sacrificed quietly, year after year, for the sake of decorum. When she excused herself before the final panel, no one stopped her. Her absence, like her presence, was processed without inquiry. She drove home in silence, letting the hum of the road replace the hollow cadence of prepared remarks. Her phone buzzed once, then again, unknown number. No voicemail. Then a text. I believe you'll want to see this before morning. Attached was a link. She opened it. It wasn't a formal article, not yet. It was a teaser, scheduled for release the next day on a respected investigative platform. The headline was restrained but unmistakable. Unspoken hierarchies at 30,000 feet when policy meets prejudice in the skies. The preview included a blurred still image of Naomi on the tarmac, her uniform crisp, her posture unmistakably that of someone in command, and beside her, Claire, mid-sentence, caught off guard. The caption did not name them, but it didn't need to. Naomi closed the link. The timing was surgical. She knew exactly who had sent it. Lucia hadn't been mentioned directly, but the style of the language, the phrasing of the teaser, it bore the fingerprint of someone who had watched carefully and spoken carefully. Someone who didn't just report a moment, but understood what made a moment matter. The message wasn't an act of betrayal. It was a warning, a kind one. Elsewhere, in a quiet cafe tucked between two unremarkable office buildings, Claire sat across from a man in his 50s, wiry, precise, with a notepad that remained mostly closed. He listened more than he asked. When she paused, he waited. When she stammered, he didn't fill the silence. And when she contradicted herself, as she did several times, he didn't flinch. "I didn't intend to discredit her," she said at one point. "It wasn't malicious. I just didn't think she was the pilot." He nodded. "But you saw her in uniform?" "Yes." "And what was your first thought?" Claire hesitated. The pause stretched too long. "That she was out of place," she said finally. "I know how that sounds." "I'm not interested in how it sounds," the reporter replied. "I'm interested in what it reveals." She closed her eyes briefly. "Then you already know more than I want to admit." He nodded again gently. "That's why it's worth sharing." Naomi met Lucia in a parking lot, unplanned. She had driven to the training center to retrieve a forgotten document, and Lucia had been leaving a debrief meeting. Their paths crossed not in confrontation, but coincidence. Lucia started to speak, but Naomi raised her hand. "I read it," she said. "It's not live yet, but I saw it." Lucia nodded, unsure whether to feel regret or resolve. "I didn't include your name," she said. "I know. I didn't do it for recognition." Naomi regarded her evenly. "You did it because no one else would." There was a brief silence. Then Naomi stepped closer. "Do you believe this story changes anything?" she asked. Lucia's answer came slowly. "I believe it names something that's been allowed to go unnamed for too long, and naming it changes how we see it, even if just a little." Naomi considered this. Then, unexpectedly, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook, faded at the edges, worn from travel. She handed it to Lucia. "My first flight log," she said, "from training. Keep it, read it. There are things in there I've never told anyone, not because they were secrets, but because no one asked." Lucia took it with both hands quietly. Naomi turned to leave, but before stepping away, she said one final thing, not as instruction, but as invitation. "Tell it right. Don't let them make it clean." At headquarters, the press team scrambled. The leak had caught them unprepared, not in facts, but in framing. They had expected a complaint, not a narrative, and certainly not one that resonated so deeply across so many unacknowledged spaces. The board convened early, silent, and tense. Marcus watched them from his seat near the end of the table, watching not the faces, but the hands, the clenched fists, the tapping fingers, the grip on pens that hadn't moved in 10 minutes. When asked for his recommendation, he didn't hesitate. "We can either posture," he said, "or we can lead. But we can't do both." They looked at him. "The question isn't whether the story is true. It's why it took someone outside the chain of command to validate the person at the center of it. That's what people will ask." "And what do you suggest?" one of the board members asked. Her tone was measured, her eyes wary. Marcus leaned forward. "We elevate her, not as a symbol, but as an authority. And we do it without asking her to smile for the cameras. We give her the platform she earned, not because of what happened, but in spite of what's been withheld from her all these years. And if she refuses," Marcus didn't blink, "then we let her refuse, and we learn why she did." That evening, Naomi stood once more before the same window in her apartment. But something had shifted. The city below was the same. The lights, the distant traffic, the soft hum of nighttime ritual. But her posture had changed. She had opened the proposal again. Not to analyze it, but to mark what had been missing. There were no provisions for redress, no mention of the women like her who hadn't filed reports because silence had been safer, no language around repair, only strategy. She picked up a pen and she began to write. Not an acceptance, not a rejection, a revision, not just to the offer. By the following week, the shape of the narrative had shifted, not because of any statement made by the company, but because of the silence it chose instead. Public curiosity, as expected, surged. Debates unfolded across comment sections, panel discussions, spun speculation into perceived fact, and digital forums dissected every frame of the now public image that had launched the broader scrutiny. But Naomi, now the reluctant center of a discussion she had never consented to lead, remained measured. She answered nothing. She withheld nothing. She watched closely. Lucia, meanwhile, found herself caught in a strange in-between. The article, now published in full and widely shared, had turned her into an unlikely proxy. She was approached on break by colleagues she barely knew, whose questions hovered near the line between concern and curiosity. Some praised her courage in coded language, others avoided her altogether. A few looked at her as though she had lit a match in a room where everyone had agreed to ignore the gas leak. But it was the older staff who lingered. One in particular, Carlos Esteban, a flight engineer with 3 decades of service and eyes that missed little, stopped her after a pre-flight check, his voice low. "They always said we had a chain of command," he told her. "But it turns out we just had a chain of silence. You broke it. Now everyone has to decide whether they were keeping quiet for survival or for convenience." Lucia didn't respond right away. She knew he wasn't really asking. In her apartment, late into the night, she had begun reading Naomi's flight log. The entries were terse, clipped, factual, but not cold. They revealed a mind trained to register detail without interpretation, emotion without indulgence, notes on turbulence, crew coordination, weather shifts, and occasionally a remark in the margins that pulled her in more than anything else. Passenger 14A, panic during descent. Noted resemblance to my sister's expression the day I left. Breathing exercises worked for both of us. And later, first time in left seat. No announcement. Still, the man in 2C refused to hand me his passport until my male co-pilot asked again. It was the kind of journal that didn't need to be poetic to carry weight. Its weight was in the restraint. In one of the last pages, a different tone emerged. "If I disappear from this system, it won't be because I failed. It will be because I refused to accept that I had to prove I belonged, while others assumed it by default." Lucia closed the notebook, understanding now that what had seemed like professionalism was, in fact, armor. She thought of returning it, but something stopped her. Not yet. At headquarters, the executive board met again, this time not in response to media pressure, but in preparation for an internal audit. The legal team had begun assembling a timeline. Every complaint, every incident report, every delay in promotion related to Naomi over the last 5 years. The pattern was difficult to ignore. Delayed reviews, performance metrics that skewed less favorable, despite high ratings in objective categories. Mentorship opportunities redirected to more compatible matches. The chairwoman, a woman named Evelyn, known for her quiet but unwavering style, reviewed the file in silence. She was not inclined toward performative outrage. She preferred data, precedent, and patterns. And what she saw disturbed her, not because it was unique, but because it was familiar. "We were not unaware," she said eventually, her voice even. "We were unmotivated to act." Her remark landed heavily because no one contradicted it. In her office, Naomi received the invitation with a flat expression. Not a public apology, not yet, but a formal acknowledgement. An offer to speak before the board, to share her experience in her own words, framed, of course, as a gesture of respect. But she recognized it for what it was: preemptive damage control, cloaked in professional courtesy. She didn't reject it. She didn't accept it either. Instead, she asked for a meeting with Evelyn. One-on-one. The request was granted. They met in a discreet conference room. No recording devices, no staff, no agenda. Evelyn sat with her hands folded, waiting. Naomi didn't make her wait long. "I'm not here to relitigate every moment I was sidelined," she began. "That list is too long, and frankly not the point. What I want to know is whether your interest in this story is about optics or ethics." Evelyn met her gaze without flinching. "Both. I won't insult you by pretending otherwise, but I am not here to control what you say. I'm here because I believe in what happens after it's been said." Naomi remained still. "Then let me speak. Not at a podium, not in a memo. I want to lead the next pilot training seminar, not just attend it, lead it. I want to talk to the new recruits before the uniform becomes a mask they wear to survive." Evelyn nodded slowly. "Done. And I want Lucia there," Naomi added. "Not as a guest, as a co-presenter." Evelyn raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Naomi didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. The day of the seminar, the room was full. More than just new hires had arrived. Junior officers, ground staff, mid-level management, and a handful of senior crew, curious and cautious. Naomi stood at the front without notes, in her uniform, the same one worn by every pilot in the room, yet different now in what it had come to represent. Lucia stood beside her, her presence quieter but no less deliberate. Naomi began not with a story, but with a question. "What do you believe the uniform entitles you to?" she asked. "Authority? Respect? Visibility?" She let the silence hold, then continued. "Now ask yourselves, what does it protect you from?" She shared stories, not dramatic, not sensational, just honest. Moments that seemed small in isolation, but accumulated into erosion. The way passengers looked past her, the subtle suggestions from supervisors to let others take the lead in high-pressure situations. The way her silence was expected, her composure interpreted as gratitude. Lucia spoke next. Not about the incident directly, but about the responsibility of witnessing. "I didn't intervene that day because I thought I could change the system. I did it because I didn't want to lie to myself later and say I hadn't seen what I saw." There was no applause when they finished, only stillness. Then, slowly, a question from the back. "What happens now?" Naomi looked at Evelyn, seated discreetly in the second row, then back to the room. "Now," she said, "we stop waiting for permission to name what we already know." Outside the seminar, on the edge of the tarmac, a new crew was preparing for departure. Among them, a young pilot, nervous, sharp, aware of the eyes watching him. He adjusted his headset, stole a glance at the cockpit where Naomi sat, co-pilot this time, not because she had to be, but because she had chosen to train him herself. Lucia stood at the gate, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning but also watching. The flight took off without delay, and somewhere over the ocean, as clouds shifted and the cabin quieted, Naomi reached into her pocket and unfolded a small page she had torn from her logbook. She didn't read it. She simply held it there, between her fingers, as if to remind herself not of what she had survived, but of what had finally begun. And far below, in offices still adjusting to a new cadence, the system, once resistant to change, began, reluctantly, imperfectly, to listen. Naomi arrived alone, without fanfare, without press, and without a prepared statement. The elevator that took her to the 37th floor was quiet, except for the hum of its cables and the low voice of the building's automated announcements. Each floor passed like a closing chapter. When the doors opened, the hallway was sterile, lined with grey carpet and institutional lighting. A single assistant waited at the end, clipboard in hand, posture professional to the point of rigidity. He greeted her by name, though she hadn't offered it, and gestured toward the conference room with a slight movement of his chin. Inside, the board was already seated. 12 people, faces marked by degrees of discomfort, caution, or curated neutrality. Evelyn sat at the far end of the long table, her expression unreadable, hands folded, a glass of still water beside her. No one stood to greet Naomi, though she noticed how several shifted in their chairs, not out of discourtesy, but uncertainty. She took her seat with practiced calm. The leather armrest creaked faintly as she settled. No one spoke, and so she began. "I imagine most of you have reviewed the report," she said, "or at least the parts that were flagged by legal." No one interrupted. "What it doesn't include," she continued, "are the moments that didn't fit neatly into forms. The first time a senior pilot handed me his jacket to have it pressed, assuming I was crew support. The silence when I logged a maintenance delay and the mechanic called to confirm, only to ask if a real pilot was available to explain. The forced smiles, the performative camaraderie. The years I convinced myself that being tolerated was a form of progress." She didn't look at her notes because there weren't any. She had lived every word. "I've had students ask me if flying ever feels like freedom, and I tell them, yes, it does. But not when you're constantly proving you've earned the right to be there." Evelyn leaned forward slightly, not interrupting, listening. "I didn't come here to indict anyone individually. That would be a waste of breath. I came because this company asked me what accountability looks like. And this is what it looks like. Not a statement, not a headline, not a policy update. It looks like reckoning." Across from her, A board member who had remained quiet until now finally spoke. If you're asking us to concede institutional failure, I think most of us are prepared to do that. Naomi's gaze didn't waver. Conceding isn't the same as confronting. What would confronting it look like? He asked. Her answer came without hesitation. Changing who gets to decide what counts as professionalism, who gets mentorship, who gets the benefit of doubt, and doing it in ways that aren't designed to protect the comfort of those already in control. Another silence followed, but this one felt different, less defensive, more aware. Evelyn broke it. We'll move forward with implementing the seminar program under your direction, but I want more than internal education. I want legacy correction. That includes public acknowledgement. Are you prepared for what that will invite? Naomi nodded. Visibility isn't new to me. What's new is not shrinking from it. The meeting concluded without applause, without ceremony. As Naomi left the room, Evelyn stood, not as a gesture of courtesy but of recognition. Outside, the day had shifted. The city, indifferent as always, moved without knowledge of what had been spoken behind glass walls. But inside the industry, small shifts had already begun. Other women had started speaking, not with outrage, but with precision. Engineers, flight attendants, former pilots who had quietly stepped away. The language was changing, not because of a campaign, but because silence was no longer a default. Lucia's inbox filled with messages, some anonymous, some signed, stories of microaggressions, derailed careers, quiet humiliations. She responded to each one, not with solutions, but with acknowledgement. The culture had shifted just enough for people to begin naming what they had survived. The airline launched the training program under Naomi's leadership. It wasn't perfect. Some resisted, some complied without understanding, but others listened. One young cadet, after a session, approached Naomi privately. A woman, barely 20, with an expression Naomi recognized, eagerness, undercut by fear of seeming too eager. "My father was a pilot," she said. "He told me not to speak up, said it would mark me. But then I read about you, and I figured being marked isn't always a bad thing." Naomi didn't respond with a platitude. She nodded, steady and silent, allowing the moment to land where it belonged, between them, unforced. Months passed. Naomi flew again. Not as often, she chose her assignments, but always on routes that included junior crews. She made time for questions. She refused to accept passive respect, and gradually the industry began adjusting not just to her presence, but to her terms. But the final call hadn't come yet. It arrived one autumn morning in the form of a letter. Not an email, not a formal notice, hand-delivered. The envelope bore the seal of the aviation regulatory body. Inside, a single-page notice. The formal reinstatement of a certification she hadn't known was under review. A certification quietly downgraded the year before due to an administrative reassessment. No one had told her, but someone had restored it. At the bottom of the page, in ink, not print, a note: "You were never underqualified. We were just late in catching up." It wasn't an apology, but it was, in its own way, an admission, and it carried more weight than press releases ever could. Later that week, she met Lucia for coffee near the airfield. The cafe was quiet, familiar, the kind of place where people came to be still. They sat by the window watching planes rise and vanish into low, brushed clouds. Lucia stirred her drink, glancing sideways. "I got offered a transfer," she said. "Ground operations, oversight role, better hours." Naomi took a sip of her own. "Are you going to take it?" "I don't know yet. I like seeing the sky this close." Naomi smiled faintly. "You can still see it, just from a different angle." Lucia nodded, not committing, not declining, just considering, the way people do when they know their choices have started to matter. Outside, a jet roared overhead. Naomi tilted her head, following its arc, and thought, not of how far she'd come, but of how much had been left unsaid all these years. It wasn't vindication she felt, or triumph. It was something quieter, the kind of peace that comes not from winning, but from refusing to vanish. There was still work ahead. That much was certain. Not all policies had changed, not all silences had been broken, but the air felt different. The resistance now was visible. named, and naming it meant it could no longer hide in plain sight. Naomi stood to leave, her bag slung casually over one shoulder. Lucia rose too, glancing once more toward the runway. "You know," she said, "I used to think courage looked like confrontation. Now I think it looks like not walking away." Naomi didn't respond with words. She placed a hand briefly on Lucia's shoulder, then turned toward the door. Outside, the wind had picked up. The sky was overcast, but not heavy. The kind of sky that suggests something is about to begin, not with thunder, but with clarity. And as Naomi walked into it, she didn't look back, not because she was leaving anything behind, but because everything ahead was finally hers to claim. 3 months passed between the reinstatement letter and the day Naomi found herself walking through the doors of a building she hadn't entered in almost 2 years. The lobby of the Aviation Commission headquarters in Washington was colder than she remembered, but that might have been the nerves she refused to name. It wasn't fear, at least not anymore. It was precision, the kind she'd learned to summon before every flight, every hearing, every moment where one misstep could be used as proof of incompetence. This time she wasn't called as a witness, nor as a plaintiff. She was invited as a consultant, not in name only. Her input was on the agenda. Evelyn had made that clear in her message. What she hadn't explained was why the chair of the Oversight Committee had personally asked for Naomi's review of a buried case file reopened after an anonymous submission. The contents of that file would shape the final arc of her journey and bring her closer to a truth she had stopped hoping for. Inside the conference room, the panel was smaller than before. Only 5 members this time, most of them younger, none familiar. That wasn't accidental. The old guard had begun to recede quietly, without press releases. A generational shift, Evelyn had called it. Naomi saw it as something closer to realignment. The case folder on the desk bore no outward markings beyond a code, FLT 391, a reference she didn't recognize immediately. But when she opened the file, a single name caught her eye, one that hadn't crossed her mind in over a decade: Mark Talbot. She felt it before she remembered it, that strange undercurrent of confusion and betrayal that never quite hardened into anger. Talbot had been a mentor once. Not officially. They never used words like that, but he had taken her under his wing during her first major rotation out of training, back when she still believed that excellence alone would secure her place. He had vouched for her, corrected her gently, advocated when others wouldn't. He had also failed her in the moment she most needed someone to stand beside her. The report laid out the rest in terse, bureaucratic prose. During a night flight in 2012, Naomi had filed a discrepancy regarding cabin pressurization protocols. The maintenance crew's review had cleared the aircraft within the hour, but her insistence on a second round of diagnostics delayed departure. Unremarkable except for the fact that her judgment had been questioned by Talbot himself, then quietly logged as inconclusive concern. What she hadn't known until now was that her call had been correct, and that the discrepancy she flagged had led to procedural changes later filed under a different name, credited to another captain on a separate route. Talbot hadn't denied her claim. He'd buried it, and someone else had profited. The Commission's interest was in the pattern. The file cross-referenced 3 similar incidents, all involving female pilots whose input had been minimized or overwritten. Naomi wasn't the only one. She was, however, the only one still flying. The chair of the panel, a man in his 40s with a disarmingly direct tone, looked at her once she'd finished reading. "We're not asking you to confirm anything you can't substantiate," he said. "We're asking if this looks familiar." Naomi met his gaze. "It does. And not just the incident, the structure." He nodded. "That's why we want you in the task force. Not as a figurehead, as a partner." The moment should have felt like redemption. It didn't. It felt like excavation. The difference was important. Later that afternoon, she found herself sitting across from Evelyn for the first time in weeks. The office had changed slightly. Fewer framed certificates, more books, a sign that Evelyn had stopped curating what people expected to see. "You knew Talbot was part of this," Naomi said without preamble. Evelyn didn't flinch. "I suspected, but it had to surface naturally. If I pushed it, the review would be dismissed as personal." political. Oh, was it personal? Evelyn considered that, then said, only in the sense that all of this is. There is no neutral ground in systems built to silence. Naomi looked past her toward the skyline just beginning to darken. The sun was low, catching the edges of the buildings in amber light. Did you ever feel like it was too late? She asked. For what? To fix it. Evelyn exhaled, not heavily, but slowly, every day. And then I remember that the system counts on that, on fatigue. Mom, that night, Naomi returned to her apartment and sat for a long time with the lights off, the city humming faintly beyond the glass. She reread the names in the report. 2 of the women had left aviation entirely. 1 had gone into training. The other was now in risk management at a rival airline. Naomi considered reaching out, not as a show of unity, as a gesture of continuity. When she finally picked up her phone, it wasn't to call anyone. It was to open an old audio file, a cockpit recording from a flight where everything had gone right. Not because it was smooth, but because she had known how to respond when it wasn't. The voice on the file wasn't hers. It was a junior officer, nervous, halting. She had guided him through turbulence with calm instructions, no flair, no dramatics, just competence. At the end, after landing, his voice cracked with quiet relief as he said, "Thanks for making me feel like I belonged." That line, spoken without awareness of its weight, echoed more loudly than anything in the commission report. In the weeks that followed, Naomi accepted the task force role. She worked closely with policy analysts, pilots, trainers, and lawyers. The work was slow, full of compromise, and sometimes infuriating, but it was real. Documents changed, guidelines were rewritten, names were restored to credits where they'd once been omitted. She also began mentoring more directly, not in seminars, but one-on-one, late-night calls, early morning check-ins, listening when that was the only thing someone needed. And slowly, she began to understand something she hadn't allowed herself to believe before. Influence wasn't what you carried into a room. It was what remained after you left. Her final encounter with Talbot came without warning. A scheduled hearing she hadn't planned to attend was moved to her jurisdiction. He arrived without a tie, looking smaller than she remembered, but not diminished. When he saw her seated near the back, he didn't flinch. He nodded barely, then turned forward. She stayed through the testimony, listened, watched, and when it was over, she walked past him without stopping. Not out of avoidance, but choice. He had already taken more time than he deserved. Outside, the wind had picked up again. Spring was breaking through the tail of winter, a new cycle, one that no longer revolved around unspoken debts. Lucia called her that evening. Her voice was clearer than usual, almost light. "I took the transfer," she said. "Started this week. It's strange, not being in the sky, but it's the right kind of strange." Naomi smiled into the receiver. "Perspective changes everything." "Does it?" Lucia asked. Naomi thought for a moment. Maybe not everything, but enough. They spoke a little longer, then hung up without ceremony. There were no declarations, no promises, just understanding. And in the stillness that followed, Naomi stood at the window again, watching the city. Planes arced above in silent choreography, not symbols, not metaphors, just machines, and the people learning finally how to be seen within them. She didn't know where the next turn would lead. She didn't need to. For the first time, the flight path was her own. Chicago's skyline blurred into a cold gray ribbon outside the terminal windows, matching the numb silence inside the waiting lounge. Morgan sat with her back straight, hands clasped loosely over her lap, her pilot's uniform pressed and immaculate despite the turbulence inside her. She was waiting, but not for clearance, not for a gate. She was waiting for a conversation she wasn't sure would ever happen, one that had been postponed too many times, not by schedules, but by old fears and the invisible walls people build between love and resentment. Danny hadn't spoken to her since that night in Atlanta, when Morgan had said too much, and Danny, perhaps, had heard too little. Or maybe she had heard exactly what Morgan meant, and that was the problem. Since then, there had only been silence. Not angry silence. Worse than that. Indifferent, distant, like their history had been put into storage, carefully labeled but forgotten. Morgan had never learned how to push through those walls. She had learned control, precision, discipline, all the traits that kept a plane in the air and her reputation intact. But they hadn't taught her what to do when the people she loved started slipping away. "Captain Francis?" The voice was calm, almost hesitant. Morgan turned her head slowly and stood. The man approaching her wore a jacket too thin for the wind outside, and his eyes, gentle, tired, bore the familiar weight of someone who used to know her. "Warren," she said, letting the syllables fall slowly from her mouth, trying to measure her reaction. He gave her a look, not quite apologetic, not quite confident. "You've done well for yourself." "I've done what I had to," she replied. The space between them wasn't just physical. It was layered with the conversations they'd never had. About her mother, about the night he left, about how easy it was to stay gone. "I saw your picture in a magazine a few months ago," he said. "Some feature on women breaking barriers in aviation. I almost didn't recognize you." Morgan tilted her head. "Because I was smiling." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. They both knew he hadn't come here for casual updates. He had come because something had changed. Or someone. "She told you," Morgan guessed. "Danny told you I reached out." Warren nodded. "She didn't tell me what you said, just that you were trying." "I've been trying for years," she said, her voice still measured, but warmer now. "You don't get credit for showing up at the end of the movie." Warren looked away for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had softened. "I'm not looking for credit. I just thought maybe I could help. She's shutting everyone out, not just you." Morgan narrowed her eyes. "Why now? What made you care now?" "She got accepted into MIT, he said quietly. "Full scholarship. She hasn't told you yet, has she?" Morgan's mouth parted slightly. She hadn't. And suddenly the quiet made more sense. Danny was on the verge of something enormous and maybe afraid of what that leap would cost her. The bitterness that held them apart. Could it survive distance, success, and the weight of a childhood never quite reconciled? "She's afraid," Warren said, "but she's proud." "Like you," Morgan sat again. "Pride's a lonely room." He sat beside her, but not too close. "Sometimes it's the only one we know how to live in." They didn't speak for a long time after that, and when Morgan finally looked up, her eyes weren't sharp or defensive anymore. They were tired, but open, the way a storm breaks. Not with a crash, but with light filtering slowly through the clouds. That evening, Morgan walked into the flight operations center earlier than necessary. She didn't need to review the flight plan again. She just needed a room that reminded her who she was, when things made sense, when the instruments worked, the sky followed rules, and her actions had clear results. But even here, that day, she wasn't alone. Elena, her first officer, was already at the dispatch monitor, her eyes flicking back and forth over the numbers. She looked up when Morgan entered. "You're early," Elena said. "So are you." But they exchanged a look that carried more than words. In the weeks since the airport incident, the one that had nearly upended both their careers, they had rebuilt a rhythm. Not quite friendship, but respect. Earned, tested, quiet. Eleanor hesitated before speaking again. "I wanted to say, that night, at the gate, I froze. I should have said something." Morgan looked at her steadily. "But you didn't. No. You thought it wouldn't matter. I thought it wouldn't change anything." Morgan walked to the window overlooking the tarmac. "Maybe it wouldn't have, but silence gives permission." Eleanor nodded. "I know that now." The door opened behind them. Dispatch handed them the final paperwork. Morgan took it, signed it, and glanced once more at Elena. "I'm not asking for loyalty, just awareness." "You have it," Elena said. "Now." Later, when they boarded the aircraft, the same jet that would carry them to San Francisco that evening, Morgan took a moment before the passengers began to file in. She stood at the front, near the cockpit, watching the cabin crew prepare. Her eyes paused on one of the flight attendants, a young woman, not more than 25, with tightly coiled hair and the kind of crisp smile that suggested nerves hidden under professionalism. The woman noticed Morgan looking and gave a small nod. There was recognition in her eyes, maybe admiration, but also something else. Morgan stepped toward her. "What's your name?" "Jasmine," she said. "First week? Third. Still feels like the first." Morgan smiled slightly. "That doesn't go away. You just learn how to walk through it." Jasmine hesitated, then asked quietly, "Is it true?" What happened at O'Hare? Morgan looked at her. What do you think happened? I think someone underestimated you, Jasmine said. Morgan considered her. People do that, until they can't anymore. Jasmine looked down, adjusting her badge, but her shoulders seemed lighter somehow. The flight left on time. The skies were calm. At 36,000 feet, above the clouds and away from the noise, Morgan felt more centered than she had in weeks. But even here, in this carefully controlled atmosphere, she knew the real turbulence was waiting on the ground. Back in Chicago, Dani stood outside her mother's apartment building, her acceptance letter to MIT folded into her coat pocket like a secret too heavy to keep, but too fragile to share. She had read it over and over again. The words were beautiful. The opportunity was everything she had dreamed. But still she stood there, unmoving, as if the next step required more than her legs could give. Inside, Morgan was unaware of the girl on the sidewalk. She was still somewhere above the Midwest, gliding toward a different coast, believing that the next conversation with her daughter might happen next week or the one after. Dani didn't knock, not yet, but she didn't leave either. And maybe that was something. In the weeks to come, the distance between them would be measured not in miles, but in decisions, and both of them, in their own way, were beginning to choose. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting elongated shadows across the tarmac as Flight 237 prepared for departure. Captain Morgan Francis stood in the cockpit, her gaze fixed on the instrument panel, but her thoughts were elsewhere. The conversation with Warren lingered in her mind, stirring emotions she had long suppressed. The revelation about Dani's acceptance to MIT had caught her off guard, highlighting the chasm that had grown between them. Elena, seated to her right, sensed the captain's distraction, but chose to remain silent. The pre-flight checks proceeded with practiced efficiency, each switch and dial a familiar ritual that grounded them in the present. The hum of the engines soon filled the cabin, a comforting reminder of the world they commanded above the clouds. As the aircraft ascended, piercing through layers of cumulus, Morgan's mind wandered to the past. She recalled the nights spent poring over flight manuals, the sacrifices made to earn her wings, and the moments missed with Dani. Regret settled in her chest, heavy and unrelenting. Hours later, as they cruised at 36,000 feet, the cockpit was bathed in the soft glow of instrument panels. Elena broke the silence, her voice measured. "Captain, may I speak candidly?" Morgan glanced at her first officer, noting the earnestness in her expression. "Go ahead." Elena hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I've observed that something's been weighing on you. If there's anything you'd like to discuss, I'm here." Morgan appreciated the offer, but wasn't accustomed to sharing personal matters. Yet, the isolation she'd felt recently made her reconsider. She exhaled slowly. "It's my daughter, Dani. We've grown distant, and I fear it's my doing." Eleanor nodded, understanding the complexities of balancing a demanding career with personal relationships. Rebuilding bridges takes time, but it's never too late to try. Their conversation was interrupted by a call from the cabin. A passenger was experiencing a medical emergency. Morgan's professional instincts took over. She coordinated with air traffic control for an emergency landing, her personal turmoil momentarily set aside as she navigated the immediate crisis. Upon landing, as paramedics attended to the passenger, Morgan found herself reflecting on the fragility of life and the importance of mending fractured relationships. The incident served as a poignant reminder that time was a luxury she couldn't afford to waste. Determined, Morgan resolved to reach out to Dani, to confront the past and forge a path forward, no matter how uncertain. The journey ahead would be turbulent, but she was prepared to navigate it, one conversation at a time. The meeting in Geneva was scheduled for dawn, though few believed it would begin on time. Diplomats were rarely punctual when the stakes involved names not yet spoken aloud. Claire had arrived 2 hours early, not to impress anyone, but because sleep had become a stranger. The rain had ceased just before her arrival, and the square outside the Palais Wilson glistened with the tired reflection of amber lights. It was not the grandeur of the venue that unsettled her, but the knowledge that everyone who mattered mattered would be in that room, and some who mattered far too much. Inside, the air carried the scent of varnish and tension. She removed her coat slowly, aware of how even gestures could be interpreted here. Gabriel had warned her of that. In these circles, posture is rhetoric, but he wasn't here. His absence, though practical, felt like a splinter beneath her skin. It was one thing to confront a bureaucracy. It was another to do it knowing that someone had erased not just documents, but entire people, and was still 2 steps ahead. At the long table, she sat near the end, flanked by 2 aides she barely trusted. Across from her was Colonel Weiss, who had arrived without entourage and without expression. If he recognized her, he made no sign of it. They had never spoken formally, only circled each other through reports, press clippings, and faintly veiled threats. Today, that would change. Claire kept her hands on the table. No papers, no laptop. Her argument didn't need notes. It needed conviction and perhaps controlled fury. She had rehearsed nothing. Rehearsals belonged to theater, and this wasn't a performance. It was a reckoning. The chair of the committee opened with protocol, his voice neutral to the point of cruelty. He acknowledged the agenda, listed the attendees, and motioned toward Claire with a courtesy that felt like a dismissal. She didn't rise. She spoke from her seat, her voice steady, unhurried. She began not with the deaths, but with the silences, the files that had vanished, the names that had been replaced with codes, the missions reclassified under doctrines no longer acknowledged. She showed no photographs. She knew they expected emotion, perhaps even collapse. Instead, she offered timelines, logistics, triangulated evidence that didn't cry out, but instead built pressure with each line, like water filling a sealed tank. Colonel Weiss remained still, arms crossed. When Claire cited the Soria Protocol, the one she had found buried in an old diplomatic pouch misfiled under agricultural treaties, he narrowed his eyes slightly, a crack in his otherwise indifferent veneer. That was the first shift. Others came more quickly. A diplomat from Oslo coughed nervously when she described the supposed humanitarian deployment that had quietly removed 2 villages from the map. Another from Lisbon whispered something to his aide when Claire described the pattern of satellite interruptions around the same regions. Then she paused, not for effect, but because she needed to know if anyone in that room still believed in shame. No one met her eyes. It was not defeat. It was confirmation. The chair tried to intervene, redirecting her toward constructive recommendations. Claire leaned forward. "My recommendation," she said, "is that we name what happened." She turned toward Weiss. "And who authorized it?" The colonel finally moved, removing his glasses and cleaning them with the edge of his sleeve. "What you're suggesting," he said calmly, "is not prosecution, it's disarmament. You want us to admit vulnerability on the record." Claire didn't respond to that. She didn't need to. The vulnerability already existed. What they feared was losing the illusion of control. And illusions, when named aloud, shattered. After the session adjourned, no one spoke to her directly. She gathered her coat, her breath slow, measured. Outside, the streets had emptied. She began walking, not toward the hotel, but toward the bridge where Gabriel had once handed her the first set of documents, back when they still believed in clean victories. Her phone buzzed once. A message. No name, only coordinates, the same format as before. She stared at it for a moment, then deleted it. Not out of fear, but because the message had already done its job. Somewhere, someone was still watching, still moving pieces. She wasn't being erased, she was being tested. The next morning she met with Armand. He hadn't changed. His coat was still too large, his voice still too soft for a man with access to more secrets than most governments. He listened as she summarized the hearing, interrupting only once to ask if Weiss had blinked. "He did," she said. "When I mentioned Soria." Armand smiled faintly. "Then we've got him." Claire raised an eyebrow. "You sound confident." "I'm not," he replied. "But confidence isn't required, just leverage." She leaned back. "And what do we do with it?" "We wait, not for them. For the moment when their fear of exposure outweighs their appetite for power." She wanted to believe him. But belief required trust, and trust had become a currency she could no longer afford. Later that day, she returned to her apartment, a space that now felt more like a checkpoint than a home. She opened the drawer beneath the bookshelf. The flash drive was still there, exactly where Gabriel had left it the last time they met. She hadn't dared plug it in, not because of what might be on it, but because of what might happen once she knew. Outside, the city carried on. Lights flickered in windows, taxis moved like insects along the wet avenues, and somewhere in the distance a siren echoed. Routine, distraction. She remained at the window for a long time, watching nothing in particular. Then, slowly, she turned toward the desk, sat down, and inserted the drive. The screen came to life, folders, names, locations, signatures, and a video file labeled only with a date, the date of the fire that destroyed the remote outpost in Calarin, the incident everyone had accepted as accidental. She hovered over it, hesitated, then pressed play. What she saw would change everything, and she knew without question that the next chapter would be the most dangerous yet. In the dim glow of her apartment, Claire sat motionless before the laptop, the weight of the flash drive's revelations pressing heavily upon her. The video she had just witnessed unraveled the official narrative of the Calarin outpost fire, exposing a deliberate act of sabotage orchestrated by operatives within her own agency. The faces in the footage were unmistakable, colleagues she had trusted, now implicated in a conspiracy that reached into the highest echelons of power. The room felt colder as the gravity of betrayal settled in. Claire's mind raced through the implications: missions compromised, lives lost, and a web of deceit that threatened the very foundation of international security. She knew that bringing this to light would not only end careers, but could destabilize alliances and ignite political turmoil. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. The message was succinct: "We need to talk. Now." It was from Armand. Claire hesitated, then replied with her address. Within minutes, a discreet knock signaled his arrival. Armand entered, his usual composed demeanor strained. He took a seat across from Claire, his eyes scanning her face for clues. "I take it you've seen the contents," he began, his voice low. Claire nodded, sliding the laptop toward him. "It's worse than we imagined," she said, her tone measured but laced with controlled anger. "This isn't just about Calarin, it's systemic." Armand leaned in, watching the damning footage. As the video ended, he exhaled slowly, absorbing the magnitude. "This explains the anomalies we've encountered. The missing files, the rerouted communications. They've been operating in the shadows, manipulating outcomes to serve an agenda we were never privy to." Claire's gaze hardened. "We can't let this stand, but exposing it, the fallout could be catastrophic." Armand met her eyes, a silent understanding passing between them. "We need a strategy. Direct confrontation would be suicide. We must be surgical, precise, identify allies we can trust, gather irrefutable evidence, and choose the right moment to act." Over the following days, Claire and Armand worked clandestinely, piecing together the puzzle. They uncovered a clandestine faction within the agency, codenamed Orion, responsible for unauthorized operations that circumvented oversight. The faction's motives were obscured by layers of misinformation, but the consequences of their actions were evident: destabilized regions, assassinations disguised as accidents, and a trail of corruption leading to influential figures. The challenge was monumental. Orion's members were entrenched, their influence pervasive. Claire and Armand's every move had to be calculated to avoid detection. They communicated through encrypted channels, met in inconspicuous locations, and relied on a network of trusted contacts cultivated over years. One evening, Claire received an anonymous tip directing her to a secluded park bench. There, she found a dossier containing detailed records of Orion's operations, complete with names, dates, and objectives. The source remained unidentified, but the information was a breakthrough. Presenting their findings to the agency's oversight committee was a delicate endeavor. Claire and Armand knew that some members might be complicit or compromised. They decided to approach Director Hensley, a seasoned official known for integrity, but also for pragmatism. In a private meeting, Claire laid out the evidence before Hensley. The director's expression remained unreadable as she sifted through the documents. After a prolonged silence, she looked up. "This is damning," Hensley acknowledged, but exposing this could fracture the agency and erode public trust. Armand leaned forward. Director, the alternative is allowing a rogue element to operate unchecked, undermining the very principles we stand for. We need to act decisively, but with discretion. Hensley nodded slowly. I'll convene a covert task force to dismantle Orion from within. This stays off the record until we have neutralized the threat. Claire, Armand, your roles will be pivotal, but understand the risks. Should this fail, there will be no safety net. The ensuing operation was a masterclass in subterfuge. Claire and Armand, alongside a select team, methodically exposed Orion's operatives, turning some into informants and apprehending others. The process was fraught with danger. Trust was a scarce commodity, and betrayal lurked in unexpected corners. As the net tightened, Orion's leaders grew desperate. Attempts were made to discredit Claire and Armand, fabricating evidence to paint them as traitors. Media outlets received anonymous tips alleging their involvement in illicit activities. The pressure was immense, but their resolve remained unshaken. In a final confrontation, Claire faced Colonel Weiss, a key figure within Orion. In a secluded safe house, they engaged in a battle of wits and wills. Weiss, cornered but defiant, attempted to justify his actions as necessary evils for national security. Claire's response was unwavering. Security built on deception and lawlessness isn't security, it's tyranny. We've upheld principles that distinguish us from the very threats we combat. You've betrayed those principles. Weiss was taken into custody, and with his arrest, Orion's infrastructure crumbled. The agency initiated reforms to prevent such corruption from taking root again, implementing stringent oversight mechanisms. In the aftermath, Claire found herself at a crossroads. The ordeal had exacted a toll, revealing the murky depths of the world she operated in. Offers came from various sectors, private security firms, international organizations, but she declined them all. One evening, as she walked along the Seine, Armand joined her. They strolled in companionable silence before he spoke. "What's next for you, Claire?" She contemplated the question, the city's lights reflecting in her eyes. "I'm not sure, but I know I need time to reflect, to heal. Perhaps there's a way to serve without losing oneself in the shadows." Armand nodded, understanding the sentiment. "Whatever path you choose, know that you've made a difference. The world is a little less dark because of you." They parted ways, each carrying the weight of their experiences, but also the hope of new beginnings. As the screen fades to black, consider the significance of the word integrity in this narrative. How does it resonate with the choices made by the characters? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're intrigued by tales of espionage and moral dilemmas, check out the next video on the screen for a deep dive into similar stories.